Welcome back, everyone. This is the Oracle Decodes the Ankh, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Ra. Ancient Egypt, Part 1. We're going to start out here once again with some info you can find on Wikipedia about the most well-recognized symbol coming out of the ancient Egyptian culture, the Ankh. Wikipedia will tell you that the origins of the Ankh are unknown. We're about to find out where the origins of the Ankh actually come from. But Wikipedia tells us the word Ankh has been found in several Egyptian words, meaning mirror, flower, bouquet, and life. And this Ankh symbol has also been called the key of life. It was commonly held in the hands of ancient Egyptian deities or being given by them to the pharaoh to represent their power to sustain life and revive human souls in the afterlife. If you've already seen any of our decoding videos before, decoding the Ankh with the help of what I've been calling the real oracle or the real all-seeing eye should be pretty easy at this point, right? So we've queued up a screenshot from Stellarium once again, looking from the perspective of someone on the earth looking up at the sky from a location 11 miles from the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, a city that's strangely enough named after a date. The 6th of October, Egypt. So facing due south from this location, indicated by the green vertical line, which is the north-south meridian line running down the vertical plane of the image, where that line crosses the red arc, known as the arc of the ecliptic, which is where all the known zodiac constellations, the sun, the moon, and all the known planets rise in the east and set in the west along. It's from this area of the sky to the Earth's horizon is where to locate what I've been calling the real all-seeing eye or the real oracle. It's the special place in the sky that we've discovered can be used to decode what we now know are the most famous stories from ancient to modern times. And we're looking now at a screenshot of what we commonly call the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere, this year happening in what we commonly call the date of June 21st of 2020. And when you look at this shot, note the location of the sun, right in the middle of that special crossing point of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic. There you will find the ancient Egyptian Ankh. Now that we've made pretty quick work of decoding this 4,000-year-old plus ancient Egyptian hieroglyph that's so well known, let's take that and get into the myth of Osiris and start out at Wikipedia once again. The Osiris myth is the most elaborate and influential story in Egyptian mythology. It concerns the murder of the god Osiris, a primeval king or pharaoh of Egypt, and its consequences. Osiris's murderer, his brother Set, usurps his throne. Meanwhile, Osiris's wife Isis restores her husband's body, allowing him for a time to be with her to conceive their son Horus together. The remainder of the story focuses on their son Horus, who eventually becomes Set's rival for the throne. But for the first part of our decoding of ancient Egypt, we're not going to take a look at the story that involves Horus quite yet. This is going to be a topic of another video when we look more at ancient Egypt, and particularly this part of the story. So back to what Wikipedia tells us. They say that the Osiris myth is complex in its symbolism and is integral to ancient Egyptian conceptions of kingship and succession, conflict between order and disorder, and especially death in the afterlife. It also expresses the essential character of each of the four deities at its center, and many elements of their worship in ancient Egyptian religion were derived from this myth. The Osiris myth reached its basic form in or around the 24th century BC. So we're talking around 4,000 plus years ago. Scholars have tried to determine the exact nature of the events that gave rise to the story, Wikipedia says, but have reached no definitive conclusions. And we certainly will come to different conclusions than many of these scholars have reached in the past, or at least any conclusions that they've told us about. So Wikipedia goes on. Parts of the myth appear in a wide variety of Egyptian texts, from funerary texts, magical spells, and short stories. And though it's more detailed and more cohesive than any other ancient Egyptian myth, there is no Egyptian source that gives a full account of it. The earliest mentions of the Osiris myth goes back to the pyramid texts and the coffin texts, and eventually ends up in the well-known Egyptian Book of the Dead. So we're going to take a look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead, probably in more detail in our next piece. But when it's talking about the pyramid texts and the coffin texts, that's probably what most people are imagining in their heads when they think about ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics being written on the walls of the pyramids, and that's exactly what they're talking about. This is where the Osiris myth goes back to. All right, so we're going to look specifically now at the death and resurrection of Osiris. At the start of the story, Wikipedia tells us, Osiris rules Egypt, having inherited the kingship from his ancestors in a lineage stretching back to the creator of the world, to Ra or Atum. Now, this is a visual representation of how Ra, who they're talking about here, Osiris got his kingship lineage from. Notice that in these representations of Ra, the most common form he's shown in is this falcon-headed god. But it's not always the case. He's also Ra represented in other forms as well, like in this particular pictogram or hieroglyph you can find as well. Ra is represented as a scarab beetle. So we're going to get into more of that here in a minute. But I also want to point out that the falcon-headed god Ra eventually will become the same form you see represented when the ancient Egyptian myth goes on to talk about Horus, who is Osiris' son. But like I said, we're going to save that information for our next video piece. Just wanted to show you how Ra is represented. All right, so it goes on, Wikipedia tells us Osiris' queen, her name is Isis. And their brother Set, and here's what they both look like here, Osiris and Isis and their brother Set, will end up being Osiris' murder, Set will, in this myth. So now you can see how they are all pictured or represented in the telling of this myth. Osiris is connected with life-giving power, righteous kingship, and the rule of Ma'at, which is the ideal natural order whose maintenance was a fundamental goal in ancient Egyptian culture. Set is associated with violence and chaos. Therefore, the slaying of Osiris symbolizes the struggle between order and chaos and the disruption of life by death. Now, by the time the basic myth reaches the time when the Book of the Dead was well known and being circulated in Egyptian culture, it goes something like this. So we're going to take some of the information that you can find on Wikipedia about this, but there's also many other sources that you can get into the research about and see for yourself that what I'm going to share with you here is a very basic telling of this section of the Osiris myth. So, Set's sister wife, Nephthys, seduces Osiris, pretending to be her sister, who is Queen Isis, right? Osiris's wife. So there's brother, sister, husband, wife, coupling or twinning going on here as well. To avenge the betrayal, Set murders Osiris, and then he takes the king's position. Set takes Osiris's dead body and cuts it into 14 pieces, and then he scatters those pieces all across Egypt. Isis, with the help of her sister Nephthys, search for and find every piece of Osiris's body except for one, Osiris's phallus. That's the one piece Isis couldn't find. Yet Isis used her magic, creating for Osiris a golden phallus, temporarily raising him from the dead for just long enough for them to magically conceive their son Horus together before Osiris dies. And this is the story about how Osiris then becomes Egypt's first mummy. After this point, Osiris is said to live on as the king of the mysterious realm called the Duat, or the land of the dead. And although he lives on in the Duat, his kingship he represented will be reborn in his son Horus, who, again, we'll get to in the next video. But for this one, let's plug in all the information from the Osiris myth that we've looked at so far into the sky story and decode it. So we're back to a perspective from someone looking up at the real oracle or the all-seeing eye in the sky who is in the city of the 6th of October in Egypt, 11 miles from the pyramids of Giza. The sun is at the cross of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic, or at the location of the Egyptians' Ankh, and we're looking at the sun right at that special crossing point around what we call the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere. Now, the Osiris myth tells us in the beginning that he inherited the kingship from Ra, correctly decoded by scholars, many of them in the past, as representing the sun. Ra is most often seen in hieroglyphics, like I said, in the form of a falcon-headed god, exactly like Horus will become, and that's Osiris' son. Again, we'll take a look at the falcon-headed god of Horus, the son of Osiris, in the next video. But the sun god Ra was represented in other forms, like I said, as well, besides the falcon. Like, again, he's shown here as a scarab beetle, known as Ra Khepri, and it's the scarab beetle holding the sun. So take a look at this specific representation of Ra as the scarab beetle, and what you'll notice in the constellation of how it appears, what we know nowadays as Cancer the crab, how it's shaped, you can see that it's going to be the following month from where we're looking at now in this screenshot that the sun is going to be found, or Ra will be found, in the constellation of Cancer that looks very much like a scarab beetle. And that's why he'll be holding the Ankh then. So the scholars in the past who've correctly decoded that Ra is the sun, well, the other piece of what's missing from this decoding is where or in what constellation throughout the year will the sun be found in? Or in other words, in which deity's hand will we find holding the Ankh? And in this screenshot, as we can see, around the summer solstice, we see the sun at the location of the Ankh. It's in the constellation of Gemini, known these days as the twins. But in the Osiris myth, perhaps to the ancient Egyptians 4,000 years ago, we can now decode that it's the ancient Egyptian god known as Set. He's depicted most often as an aardvark-type animal, or perhaps a jackal, others may have thought, but scholars kind of leave it up to calling it the Set animal, because they just really couldn't figure out exactly what he is. But now we know why. They had a harder time decoding this one, figuring out what creature could have those squared-off horns and long snout, when it's clearly a hieroglyphic representation of the constellation of the twins, or Gemini, that they were looking at in the sky. The twins is something the ancient Egyptians also clearly saw and used in this myth and many others, by making Set a twin or a brother of Osiris, the brother in the myth that Set murders. Pretty mind-blowing to be decoding what may be some 4,000-year-old plus ancient Egyptian sky stories told in hieroglyphics, huh? Did you ever think you would be able to do such a thing? I know I didn't. All right, so let's get to another screenshot, this time at sunrise, the time most scholars agree that the Egyptian calendar day begins. So we're now 10 days past the summer solstice, looking at what we commonly call July 1st of 2020 this year, where we see that the sun comes up in the east in the constellation of Gemini this time of year. Or in other words, the sun is powering the deity Set at this time. And at midday, it will be set at the position of the Ankh. And the sun will continue on to sunset in the constellation of Gemini this time of year, or the sun will set with the deity Set. Is there any doubt now where the term sunset comes from? Now, if you look over on the eastern horizon, while the sun is going down in the west with Set, you will find his twin or his brother Osiris rising at the same time. Nowadays, we call this constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent handler. But if you look at how the ancient Egyptians made an image to represent the pharaoh or ruler of the dead, Osiris, the large oblong crown on his head and the crook and flail he carries make perfect sense when looking at and comparing it to how the constellation today, known as Ophiuchus, is shaped. Now, to decode this part of the myth correctly, we have to mark this as hour 1 as we watch the constellation of Ophiuchus, or, in this myth, Osiris's journey in the night sky, and find out why he was given the role of ruling the land of the dead in ancient Egypt. This first hour is when the sun is with Set, going down in the west, and the entire constellation of Ophiuchus, or Osiris, is completely risen at this time over the eastern horizon, and it will be Osiris then who begins the night, being fully risen over the eastern horizon where things begin. His rulership over the nighttime sky, or the land of the dead in this story. This is the reason why Osiris was Egypt's first mummy, and why, when the Egyptians drew a representation of Osiris, he was dressed as he was mummified, as you can see. We're now at hour 3. Jumping ahead 3 more hours, to hour 6 in Osiris's journey. Now going ahead 4 more hours to the 10th hour mark. Let's take a look at Osiris just above the western horizon, and on the eastern horizon, you'll see the constellation of Taurus in alignment with the planet Venus. The planet Venus representing Isis's sister Nephthys, the wife of Set, who murdered his brother Osiris after Nephthys seduced him. And now Venus, or Nephthys, is helping her sister Isis, Osiris's queen, representing the constellation of Taurus, find the 14 pieces of Osiris's body that were scattered throughout Egypt. Depictions of Osiris's queen Isis most often show Isis with a crown on her head that resemble the horns of a bull, which obviously encodes for the constellation of Taurus, or the bull. But she's often depicted and described in bird form, with her arms and wings outstretched, like in this depiction, which all now make perfect sense when looking at the shape of the constellation of Taurus in the sky. Indeed, this could be easily interpreted as both a bull or a large bird with outstretched wings, right? But from where we're looking now at the 10-hour mark, notice that the entire constellation of Taurus is not yet completely mated above the eastern horizon. While over on the western horizon, it's the last hour that the entire constellation of Ophiuchus, or Isis's husband Osiris, will be seen over the horizon as it begins to set. And so before we advance forward, notice that the first part of the constellation of Ophiuchus that will go down first is the serpent part. Or for this story, you can see it will be the only part of Osiris's body that Isis and her sister Nephthys can't find, Osiris's phallus. Now at the 11th hour mark, when the constellation of Taurus, or Isis, is now fully risen over the eastern horizon, you can see that it's Osiris's phallus that is now below the western horizon, where Isis can't find it and has to make by magic a golden phallus so they can conceive their child. And as we move forward to the 12th hour mark, just as the sun is going to rise again in the east, the sun's power with Set, the usurper of Osiris's kingship after Set murdered him, now has been placed in the correct sky story setting, as we see the constellation of Ophiuchus, or Osiris, is descending further in the darkness, underground, in the land of the dead, and Isis will be making a magical golden phallus by the morning sun to conceive their son. And it all fits. As we watch the end of the journey here for the constellation of Ophiuchus, or Osiris, in the summer sky over the pyramids at Giza, note that it was a 14-hour trip for Osiris, representing the same 14 pieces that Set cut his murdered brother Osiris's body into, that his queen Isis gathered together and resurrected. Another amazing discovery here, given us the ability to decode a 4,000-year-old plus and older ancient Egyptian hieroglyph and myth. Something I just have to acknowledge the real creator of all for blessing us with, once again, this mind-blowing knowledge to share with all of you who care to see too. We'll have more to come in the next video as we get more into decoding ancient Egypt in part 2. So for now, we'll end it here, and until next time, be well.